Welcome to all back to our fourth meeting. We actually have some new faces around the table, so I actually would like to do the sort of typical introduction thing. If we could just go around the table, introduce yourself. I'm obviously Bruce Lehman. I'm the director of the commission.
Steve Martell, quantitative staff here at the commission.
Per Odegaard of the Fishing Vessel Vancy.
Bruce Gabrus, I'm official vessel Blue Chip. It's Class C, primarily 3A halibut and salmon.
Peggy Parker, the Halibut Association of North America.
Tom Markin, California Sports Rep.
Jeff Kaufman, Fishing Vessel Bay Rose.
Scott Meyer, Alaska Department of Fish and Game.
Rachel Baker, National Marine Fisheries Service, Alaska Region.
Brad Muro, a Canadian processor.
Chris Spohr, Commercial Fishing Canada.
Katarina Bo, I'm a PhD student working with Steve in the MSAB framework.
Paul Ryle, Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
Jim Balziger, National Marine Fisheries Service, and even though Paul didn't say it, we're both commissioners.
Jim Lane, the Toronto Tribal Council, Canada.
Alan Hicks, National Marine Fisheries Service at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center.
I'm Carrie McGilliard at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center.
Ian Stewart, quantitative staff here at the Commission.
Michelle Culver, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and representative on the Pacific Fishery Management Council.
Scott Mazzoni, Area 2A Tribal Representative.
John Woodruff with Icicle Seafoods.
Greg Elwood, Fishing Vessel Western Freedom, U.S.
And Dan Hall, North Pacific Council.
Chair. Okay, welcome everyone. Just a reminder, we are broadcasting. Yes, Jim.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have another commissioner in the back row to introduce, who's Bob Elverson, and even though I think that I belong to this seat, he will substitute for me, so it might be useful if people know who he is. I think everybody knows.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm sorry I overlooked you, Bob. One of my bosses, too. This is really bad. Anyway, just a reminder, we are broadcasting this, so anytime you're speaking, please press your microphone switch and please turn it off when you're finished. We have actually a fair number of things we'd like to get done here, but one of the first things we'd like to do is just kind of review where we are and how we got here. Steve, you have a fairly detailed set of meeting presentations on this thing, and I think I'll just pass part of it over to you. But one of the things I wanted to highlight to you before we get actually started on this thing is that we wanted to introduce to you something that we're going to be talking about tomorrow afternoon, and that is potentially having a new sort of what we're calling a governance structure for this, where we are asking you to think about having two co-chairs, one from U.S., one from Canada, and these co-chairs would be tasked with doing the reporting of this process through the Commission, both at its interim meeting and the annual meeting. We really believe that it's important that this body sort of take ownership of the process. It's not necessarily a staff process, but obviously we're sitting here and trying to resource this as well as we can on this. But I think it's important that we consider this as a different kind of governance structure so that you folks realize that this is really your process as much as it is anybody else's process here. So we're going to be talking about this tomorrow afternoon, but I wanted to plant that seed in your minds right now because that's what we will be asking you to think about there. Our primary purposes here for this meeting is to flesh out, again, our sort of management procedures and objectives, but primarily to be looking at a new tool that Steve has been developing, and I know we've been waiting for a tool that was actually using the real halibut data, and I think Steve is a long ways along towards that. So I'm just going to pass it over to you right now, Steve, if you want to sort of start on some of the things, and we'll sort of tag team a bit on it.
Sure. Just like the other meetings, I really encourage a sort of organic discussion as things evolve and questions come up, so please feel free when something hits your mind and you want to speak to it. If it's an important issue, we'll break from the presentation and speak to those issues. If somehow Steve Keith can put Yoda Jedi Master up there. Thank you. Okay. 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 This is our interface between a real computer and toy computers. This is actually the 4th meeting. I can't believe we've been at this process now for 2 years. We started this process 2 years ago this week. And the agenda, I look back at the first meeting, we've come a long ways. We've made some progress. And this week, or this meeting this week, I'm going to show you some new stuff that's, I'll plant the seed right now, that sort of, we all have our intuitions about how to do these things. Everybody says we should change the size limits, or we should do X and Y and Z. So what we are really trying to do here is give you some tools to allow you to sort of take your intuitions and explore them a little bit further. And there'll be more on that. What I really wanted to do today was sort of review where we were last meeting and give you one of the examples that had some of the counterintuitive results. And so that's sort of a summary review of the MSAB meeting number 3. And then speak briefly on the progress we've made in conditioning the coastwide operating model with the Pacific Halibut data. The most important part there is the break at 2:30, and then we're going to engage into a bit of a discussion on creating the processes of creating alternative scenarios, and this part of the discussion will basically be an example of why it's important to recognize uncertainty and what's sensitive. So Ian's going to show you a lot of sensitivity analysis, and they may be sensitive to the model fitting, or insensitive to the model fitting, but they're extremely sensitive to the policies. So I want to really introduce this concept and break it down for you. And then the rest of the day we'll be focusing on this new tool we've developed, and we'll spend a considerable amount of time mostly explaining the instructions to Monopoly, so I can ensure you that you know how to use the tool and explain it to your colleagues. And then lastly, if we get to it, if not, we can continue tomorrow morning, is a more focused discussion on research priorities and starting to generate the list of specific questions. I spoke to Bruce earlier on this subject. There's been just about every meeting I go to that involves the word halibut and some other alternative policy, almost half the sentences end with, that will be a good thing to test with MSE. And at some point we've got to sit down and start refining the list of things we can do before I die. And then we'll adjourn. Tomorrow, we'll discuss this more tomorrow. So the objectives are really to update you on the status of where we are with our objectives of the management strategy evaluation process, to look at the current status of the coastwide operating model and discuss a few of the details that we're working on. And then expend a considerable amount of time exploring this new tool. And then tomorrow we have Alan Hicks here from the Northwest Center, who's been engaged in a very similar process with Pacific hake fisheries, another transboundary stock, which has a very different agreement. We have an apportionment scheme for managing our stock. The hake treaty actually has an allocation scheme between the two countries, so there's some very interesting differences between how the two processes have evolved, and I think Alan will share with you some of the experiences they've gone through with that. And then really to focus on the research priorities, so it keeps me from running off dead-end roads. And then lastly, a selection of chairs and co-chairs and developing the procedures for reporting this process to the Commission and how this process should continue to move forward. So any questions before I jump in to all this stuff? Perfect. I love putting a slide up there that says questions, and there are none. So review of where we were last meeting. Bruce, do you want to jump into the objectives first? Sure. I'll get Ian to do that, or Steve to do it.
Now we have to divest Steve of all his control.
We'll be back.
Yeah. Okay, so this is just to bring you back from where we were at the end of our last meeting. We had We started off with our 5 overarching objectives: sustainability, fisheries sustainability and stability, assurance of access, minimizing bycatch mortality, and serving consumer needs. From that, we also worked on what management procedures that were the candidate procedures, and some of these were looking at doing a total mortality. And for those of you who have been following what's been going on in both the council and the commissioner arena, primarily the work of Ian Stewart has developed a document on looking at accounting for total mortality and how we do the assignment of available yield for the halibut fishery, and trying to look directly at trade-offs and various components of total mortality, and he'll be reviewing part of that at this meeting. That was a major document that the commissioners asked us to produce, and we also gave to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council in June of this year, and then in more detail to our commissioners at a work meeting in September. And it's something that's actually helped to unify some of the thinking within the staff about looking at total mortality accounting and putting everything into the same framework. And I think this is for us, this is kind of an exciting direction, because it's helped us unify some stuff that were really kind of disparate between the harvest policy and the catch accounting type of approach to it. Some of the other management procedures we talked about were size limits, both the minimum size limits and things like having no size limits. The control rules we use for the harvest strategy, including the relative harvest rates as well as the 30-20 control rule. Whether or not things like national shares made sense. And this is what Alan's dealing with in the Pacific hake fishery, and some of the things that we want to be thinking about. And other things of bycatch mitigation in terms of compensation among areas for bycatch in a particular area. We then, with the help of, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Bruce. Just on that last one, the bycatch mitigation, I just wanted to note that in contrast to most of those other management procedures, there was pretty strong disagreement about that particular one. There was, I think, a fair amount of consensus on looking at all the other ones, but not this one.
Maybe you could expand on that, Dan, because I think there certainly was a view around the table about considering this. Now, whether we actually want to implement that, it's maybe a separate issue. Maybe you could just expand what you were thinking on that.
So the question is, where does it end? If the folks in the towards the southern end of the range of the regulatory areas want to be compensated because there's bycatch further to the west, and then the guys in the middle of the area want to be compensated because there's bycatch in the Bering Sea, where does it end? And I think that was the discussion that we had, and that was only one aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct. I think but there was the broader issue of compensation in a biological sense as opposed to compensation in a catch accounting kind of sense, Dan. I think it's part of perhaps a broader issue than just the sort of, you should get this because somebody took that type thing. So what we had at the, can I go down on this? I can, right? I want to make this a bit smaller if I can. That's better, okay. I don't have a... So what we came up with the help of a little working group that sort of spun itself off in the middle of our meeting last week was looking at some candidate goals and objectives for the MSE process. And when we finished on that, the group also asked to have some staff comments on this, and these were based around the broad goals, the overarching goals, and then some of the objectives we had in here. So looking at these in particular, the biological sustainability ones, there was an objective in there in terms of the level of biomass below which no fishing occurs, and then there was a listing of the performance metrics that would be involved with this, and maintaining minimum spawning biomass or numbers of mature females with particular probabilities. And this gets back to Steve's original point, is that we have a performance metric, you have a probability, and you have a time frame over which you want to do that. This was sent out to you, and there's a list of some of the staff comments in these. In general, I think we were pretty much on the same page in these as we were going through that, but when we went to review these, there were different ways of looking at this, in particular things like the biological sustainability and limits around the stock biomass. Looking at number of females and spawning biomass can kind of be equivalent, but the objective should also be evaluated with respect to the average female size in the catch, because this may affect the performance of the fishery in terms of what a user may be looking at in terms of his average catch size, and that can become an objective on its own for particular categories of users. In many of the instances of these candidate goals and objectives, part of the current harvest policy is looking at the probabilities relative to background recruitment variability, because that can be one of the key things in whether or not you can achieve some of these goals is what's the background variability in recruitment that we're dealing with in terms of trying to achieve particular yields. We look down to some of the things like maintaining spawning biomass at particular levels. One of the key points here is to keep going back to this thing of what's the background level of recruitment, because that's what you have to evaluate your ability to achieve those objectives as is relative to what Mother Nature is dishing out to you at the beginning of each stage. I'm not going to go through these all in detail. I just wanted to bring us back to what we were looking at for these. If we're looking at things like maintaining things like maximum yield in each regulatory area, this becomes a very involved process to try and evaluate, because there are performance metrics that you can achieve in a coast-wide basis, but what happens in an individual area basis, and this relates directly back to what I was talking about, Dan, in terms of compensation mitigation in a biological sense as opposed to in a direct yield fishery sense for it. These things are important in us trying to understand these things. For example, and you said here you could achieve 70% of the average catch in 90 out of 100 cases, but if recruitment variability is outside of that, you can sometimes drop into a hole, and that's the understanding you have to bring along to trying to set that up as a hardwired objective for the process. We're also concerned, and this is going to come up again when we start talking about minimum size limits, is looking at the performance metric of wastage in a particular fishery, whether it be wastage or bycatch, depending on the fisheries. It all has to do with what the ratio of sublegal to legal is, and this is tied to what we establish a minimum size limit should be. If you don't have a minimum size limit, a lot of these discussions become moot, or you get now into a strictly yield optimization perspective, then you get into a regulatory framework. And that's the last thing that was the sort of little bullets we had at the bottom of this table is probably the most important one, is that there's likely to be interaction between the conservation targets and the harvest rate objectives, and their probabilities are all going to be dependent on things like the yield variation and what are the economic standards of the participants. Each of you has a particular set of economic standards that might be important to you, but they're not necessarily coincident with what, for example, a commercial and a sports fisherman might think are the acceptable economic standards for performance, so they could be grossly different. And those are the sorts of things that we as a group have to put into the evaluation process. And what you'll see in some of the work that Steve has been able to produce up until now, you're going to start to be able to look at those direct trade-offs here, and that's probably the most important part of the MSC process, is understanding those trade-offs and being able to design management procedures that are going to be robust to the joint needs of all of the people involved with it, as well as the interaction of the biological variability and the harvest goals of the participants. So this is just kind of a background of where we were last meeting, what we got to at the end of the meeting, and trying to identify and focus more on some of the objectives and goals that we have for this. So over to you, Steve.
Okay. So, again, I just want to review one of the case studies we looked at the last meeting, and just to refresh your minds, what we did was using some simulated data on a fake example, actually out of a textbook written by Ray Hilborn and Mark Mangle. We looked at a generic age-structured model with a halibut-like fish. We had two scenarios that are things that we can't manage, and this is recruitment variability, one where recruitment was essentially from a stationary distribution, the other one where recruitment had positive phases associated with an index like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and a negative phase. So recruitment would jump up for high periods and then be low for long periods, etc. We looked at 4 alternative procedures. I'm not going to go through each of them here, but the 2 important procedures were, one is where we had no size limits in the fishery, and another procedure where we had a size limit of 82 centimeters or 26 inches, and both procedures used a fixed harvest rate. And what we showed through this, we called them tulip plots, is as you project into the future, and in this case the future was very confusing, 1989. So we're taking you way back to the future, and we're projecting forward from 1989. This is unfortunately when the textbook was published, and looking forward in time. And you can see these envelopes of 100 realizations where recruitment was either just deterministic and the stock would go down, or the stock may go up and may go down depending on recruitment variation. And then when we imposed a size limit in this fishery, we saw that this was actually a really good thing for the spawning biomass. It would prevent the spawning biomass falling from as rapidly as it would, and in a case where you have large non-stationary effects and recruitment variability, it tended to stabilize some efforts. And this was really at no cost to the fishery. In terms of the landed value of the catch, you essentially achieved slightly more catch because there was more spawning stock biomass. And so what we tried to show you was that there was some pros of imposing a size limit in a fishery. You actually get increased spawning stock biomass. You get roughly similar average yields over the long term, and after the age structure has restabilized owing to the change in harvest policy. And the big issue was, what were the cons? And this is where the counterintuitive result came in. It basically costs you twice the effort to attain the same catch, because what you're doing is you're catching a lot of fish, but they're of sublegal size, so you throw them back and put the gear back in the water again. And this was the exercise we went through, and this is essentially what high grading imposes, is if you get a fixed 50,000-pound quota and you catch a whole bunch of fish of various sizes, but you're only allowed to keep 50% of those sizes, you got to fish twice as much to actually fill your quota. Peggy.
So I don't remember us talking last time about the other con, which would be those fish we throw overboard not surviving, or what percentage wouldn't be. So would mortality, I mean, obviously this talks about fishing mortality. Go ahead.
Your point is well taken. I didn't explain in the procedures in setting this up that a fraction of the fish you throw overboard, in fact it was 16%, die. So you would never have a chance to recover those fish. And as that discard mortality rate increases, you would need more and more fishing effort. That's a great question. I'm going to say it just like Ian does. That's a great question. and it will be a great example for the discussion we're going to have a little later on in terms of understanding or using your intuition like that to try and figure out what really happens. And the thought exercise isn't fully fleshed out, so we're trying to help you with that. In terms of highlights from what came out of that meeting, last meeting, I think it was meeting 2 that I sold ice to Eskimos, but yeah, meeting 3, the highlights were we're really trying to use these tools to highlight and identify the trade-offs among the conflicting objectives in terms of conservation and having a stable fishery that doesn't have huge fluctuations in catch. We also highlighted the need from the previous meeting that we need to have joint consideration in all the performance metrics. You can't just simply look at it from a fisher's perspective and not think about the economics from a processor's perspective. One of the important things we heard from the last meeting is if the processors lose market share, it's really hard to get that back again. So we have to take into consideration both diversity of opportunities in the fishery as well as the diversity of opportunities in the processing sector. We, at the beginning of the last meeting, we had a feedback from all of you on your sort of dialogue you had with the stakeholders. In summary, some of the responses we heard was there's a very diverse range of interests. One of the key things that sort of came out of this is that the integration of the different agencies, so the North Pacific and Pacific Fisheries Management Councils, DFO, and the IPHC are all jointly trying to deal with halibut mortality in one form or another. And the two are really connected and interconnected. Another quote, one of my favorites, was somebody who's probably a realist. Don't fall in love with your models. I think the point they were really trying to make is that you need to validate these things with data, and I think we're moving in that process. There's some confusion, and I think there still is some confusion about the role the Management Strategy Advisory Board and the Management Strategy Evaluation process is in the overall Commission's decision-making process. And I think we need to sit down and think about the governance and how we're going to structure that so there is clarity in how this process informs the decision-making process in the Commission.
So, Steve,
I knew there was going to be a question on that. Thank you.
On that, when we hear about the I don't know if we call it whiting or Pacific hake anymore, will we talk about how that question will be answered relative to hake, so we get a little background on that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll do my best.
We'll put Alan on the spot. That's the beauty, and I'm sure when I go to Alan's meetings, he'll put me on the spot. So it's a two-way street.
Stop for a second. Yeah, maybe we could just take a brief pause here and see if there are any other inputs that you got from your colleagues in your discussions that might bear on this topic about the integration of the MSE process with the overall management process. Were there any other comments that people got from their colleagues in between the meetings?
Is that a question for me specifically? Or? Okay.
You can certainly answer.
No, I will answer that tomorrow.
I was interested if there were other comments from the MSAB members that you had received from some of your colleagues when you're talking about this. Bruce?
Yeah, it's Bruce Gabris. Actually, when you're trying to describe the process, now obviously there are users that are interested in it. They want to know when it's going to impact on the decision-making model, and the commissioners, with the input there. So that was probably, and I didn't really have a good answer to that. I said it probably would not be this meeting, this coming, this next cycle here for the annual meeting. But short of that, I didn't really have an answer.
Just to follow up on a comment, I don't think it has had any direct input on the meeting, but I think some of the issues we brought up here regarding size limits have indirectly affected our process. We're certainly looking at those issues, mostly because that's what interests me, but I think that the MSAB needs to sort of, and this is the laundry list I referred to, they need to start writing down of what items interest them and how it can influence the process. Per.
Yeah, the only comment I've gotten from our group, they're wondering, is the MSC designed to eliminate the conference board? That was their question.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I think that is that was a fear that was expressed early on in the process here, and I don't think that was the case at all. I mean, that's why we wanted to contemplate a different kind of governance process that this group could report back to not only the Commission but to the conference board, so that you could talk directly to those folks and both get their input and allay some of those fears.
Yeah, moreover, I think the tools and stuff we're developing here would actually help the conference board in their processes as well in terms of understanding the dynamics and the decision making and other rational events that may or may not happen. Okay, moving forward. We've had several discussions about candidate objectives, and I think we're sort of at an asymptote here for a little while once we start looking at and implementing asymptote? Sorry, flat spot, thank you. I'm a mathematician by training and not a linguist by any means. plateaus. In terms of developing these objectives any further until we start getting some feedback from the operating model and our process. And so there's always input for refining these objectives in the future, and it'll certainly, this discussion won't continue. I don't think in this meeting we're going to have a lot of discussion further on the objectives. But in broad terms, conservation remains a high priority of the Management Strategy Advisory Board. We did revisit the management objectives we initially developed in meeting number 2 in our previous meeting. We spent a considerable amount of time discussing area-specific objectives versus coast-wide objectives, and I think we all agreed, or we did all agree, that in the short term we really need to focus on the coast-wide objectives, because that will be the first step in implementing these operating models, is looking at the big coast-wide picture. Over the long term, we can start to integrate more refined area-specific objectives as we better understand those trade-offs, and those trade-offs mostly being the migration of fish, small fish, from one area to larger fish to other areas. We developed, as Bruce showed you earlier, a modified table stating the objectives, and then the IPHC staff also commented on these objectives from the previous meeting. And Bruce just went over these right now. Bycatch impacts, the discussion was really focused on the multiple agencies involved in dealing with bycatch. It's from the Halibut Commission's perspective, it's simply an input that goes into our assessment process, and I think we really need to, not only is it an input that goes into our assessment process, it's also a key input that goes into our harvest policy process. And this is what I hope to bring home today, is that understanding the impacts of this really call for a joint protocol committee between these multiple agencies that are dealing with halibut bycatch issues, and that is what the Management Strategy Advisory Board did suggest in our last meeting, is that we have some sort of joint protocol meeting between these agencies. We've already done the staff ranking of the objectives, and the last part of this future step from our previous meeting was really to appoint a chair and co-chairs from preferably Canada and the US, and then report on this process to the Commission, and we'll have more on that tomorrow afternoon. So any questions regarding the highlights from meeting 3? I just want to refresh all your memories so I can now take you into the domain of huge uncertainty. Okay. For those of you who are new to this meeting, the previous 3 meetings, we talked a lot about what an operating model is and how management strategy evaluation works. I'm not going to focus on much of that at all today, but I did want to sort of take you through where we are at on the current status of the operating model, and of course why we need to condition the operating model on Pacific halibut data. We now have a coast-wide halibut data set assembled and a model built using the Pacific halibut data that will be part of the operating model. We're in the sort of early stages of fitting these models and making the modifications that are necessary to subsume a lot of the assumptions that Ian uses in the ensemble model approach. Because the assessment and the harvest policy are linked to each other, Ian and I are sort of, when we have free time, which is rarely, been working back and forth trying to make sure that we do this. Our primary objective in the next little while is to actually take the operating model that does the assessment and actually make it part of the ensemble model that's used in the assessment, and that way that linkage that we use in our annual assessment process will forever be within our harvest policy process. So this is something that the Halibut Commission didn't have in previous years. There was sort of a simulation model built back in 2006, I can't remember the year exactly, where the inputs were used at that time to develop the harvest policy, and then we haven't updated the harvest policy since then. So what we're hoping to do is make this all an integrated framework, so as we learn about the stock and as we make changes to our management procedures, not only is the assessment model and the suite of models we use in the assessment up to date with that, but we can also evaluate those things in the harvest policy. One of the key questions we get from the management strategy evaluation process is how we deal with the downstream effects of bycatch and other fisheries in other areas, and this calls for really a spatially explicit representation of the Pacific halibut. We have a very data-rich, I feel bad saying this in front of my NOAA colleagues, but we have a fairly data-rich but very few quantitative scientists to help us deal with the huge amount of data we have here. And then the reason I say I feel sorry for this is DFO and some of the staff at NOAA have one person working on 10 stocks, and we have 30 people working on one stock, so my apologies. In terms of conditioning the operating model on the actual historical halibut data, I'm not going to show you anything here. There is an interface that you'll be able to view online when we get to that part. It's work in progress. As these things get updated, it'll all be online. And our intentions is that you'll be able to see alternative scenarios developed online. Okay. Big graphic here. I'll just wait for a second. The next part of this talk is going to be a little bit of a mind bender. I enjoy doing these things to you guys, and there'll be a pop quiz at the end of this, so pay attention. Peggy's going to buy dinner for the answer who wins. When we talk about model scenarios, what we're really focusing on in terms of the operating model is we usually have a model that contains the biology of the animal. We'll have other submodels that deal with how the fishery responds to changes in management, so we call this a fishing effort dynamics module. And then there's an overall sort of governance model shown here in red that details the management. With regards to scenarios, what we're trying to do when we set up different model scenarios is we're essentially trying to establish a range that captures the uncertainty with respect to harvest policy, and that's the summary. I want to take you back where we were a few meetings ago. We have this huge laundry list of things we worry about: size limits and recruitment variation and migration and changes, range contraction and wastage and discard mortality rates. And what I had asked you to do is to sort of categorize these things into a matrix of things that we can manage, such as size limits and TACs and FCEYs and all the terminology we have, and things we can't manage, like variability in recruitment, catch limits and other fisheries, maybe one of those things, allocation of dirty versus less dirty bycatch fisheries. Those may be outside the jurisdiction of the domain, but the idea is really to think about scenarios being things we can't manage, like recruitment variation, migration, and procedures such as size limits or regulations that we can't manage that affect that fishery. And then we also ask you to think about things we're certain about, so we have a lot of data or pretty good understanding, and things we're uncertain about, such as migration. We know it happens, but we're uncertain about what the rates of migration are and how the stock would contract in years of poor recruitment versus years of good recruitment. And this is usually, oh, I forgot to get rid of that stupid thing. This is what we use to set up and capture the range of uncertainty in our scenarios, so the plausible hypotheses about the biology. So when we talk about model selection in terms of stock assessment, it's very different than when we talk about model selection in terms of using it to test management procedures. Stock assessment, we're generally trying to find the model that fits the data the best, whereas an operating model in which you want to test harvest policies and ensure your policies are robust to uncertainty, you want to select models that basically encompass the range of hypothesized uncertainty. Now, the Halibut Commission, as of last year, Ian introduced the concept of using an ensemble model approach, and he has a wonderful example that you used to watch CNN, and there would be what's his name, Anderson Cooper tied to a lamppost somewhere with 100-mile-an-hour wind blowing at him was the model they used to use. Now they have a whole bunch of computer scientists who basically come up with alternative hypotheses about how they think the hurricane is going to move forward in time and what the wind speeds are going to be. And what they do is they present the results from all of those models, and then it's up to the decision makers to assess how important the risk is in those cases. This approach is a very sufficient starting point for an operating model, but it has some limitations, just like the hurricane forecasting. A lot of the models, or all of the models within the suite, often make the same assumptions. And so if there's one thing you're not including in the model, or none of the models include, that could have a huge impact in policy, for example, we deal with migration implicitly right now through having time-varying selectivity in the fishery. So when fish move around, selectivity changes, and it's not because the fishing gear changes, it's just because the availability of fish in different regions changes, and that's a migration effect. You could actually build a model that explicitly deals with migration, and then at that point you can actually see how migration rates of X, Y, and Z impact areas downstream, whereas the current method we have right now can't deal with those. Moreover, when you're looking at an assessment framework, you tend to focus on how well does the suite of models perform statistically, instead in terms of how well do they explain the historical data, and less on how well those models will predict the future. So that's generally where we're focusing. The MSE process is trying to say, we don't know really which model is right, we don't know what the future is going to be, but if we simulate a range of futures and we come up with a procedure or a set of procedures that's robust to this suite of models we've chosen, then hopefully we can start to make more informed and better decisions in the future. Please.
So I think I missed something on there, but was I hearing that, for instance, if you had some assumption that you were comfortable with on migration pattern, that you can only work that in an ensemble model, or you cannot do it on a single model? What were you trying to suggest there?
So, for example, the three model, we had 3 models last year for the ensemble. Yeah, the 3 models we had last year in our approach all made the same assumptions about migration. We didn't explicitly model it, but we allowed selectivity, which is a product of availability and the probability of catching a fish given it's there. We allow it to change every year, which would reflect the redistribution of fish as they move up and down the coast or move to different areas. Now, an ensemble model is just a collection of models. So my point is that all 3 of those models make the same assumptions about the data. So someone else, or Ian, when he gets a 4th computer in his office, will have a 4th model that explicitly models migration in a very different way. Rather than, he may have fixed selectivities in an area, but then actually explicitly move fish from 2B to 2A to 2C to 2B, etc., through some sort of matrix. And that model makes very different assumptions about the data. So my point is that there's always one assumption out there that you can't test because you either don't have the data or the technology or the computing power to test it. And that's what my approach is, or my issue is, in terms of the ensemble approach being limited, having some limitations in its scope. That being said, in our previous meetings, one of the things we talked about in the operating model is that we really need to have a spatially explicit operating model, because many of the questions with respect to how we manage the halibut stock deal with migration as well as area-specific selectivities. And that was, we can build an operating model that generates data that way and then test the ensemble models to see if they're an accurate approximation of reality, if that makes more sense. You can have a real model walk down the runway and show off clothes, or you can have a robot walk down the runway and show off clothes. The point is they're both wearing the same clothes, and the point is which one looks better. Now he's really confused. John.
Well, I think the real question, at least for me in listening to all this, is how do you know the difference? How do you know which is the real model and which is the robot?
We planned that one out.
And so just, I might have missed meeting 3 because there was a bunch of stuff there I didn't recognize. I don't think I did, but I guess, you know, when you were talking, Steve, what I wrote down is, because you said something about your decisions, so the question is, at least from my perspective, what occurred to me is, how do you know when you make a decision it's a good decision? And I think if I'm looking around, the only way I know is, at least in this case, is you look back and you say, well, you made a decision to catch this much fish in 3A, and now 2 years hence, your assessment of the biomass in 3A is something different than you expected, then probably it wasn't a good decision, or there's something else going on. Anyway.
Yeah, you make a perfect and valid point. The reason you have an operating model is, and one of the jobs of the operating model is to both represent the truth with respect to the parameters and how you understand the model, and that model then generates the data from which Ian's assessments would then go and interpret. Now, your point is a hindcasting sort of view of the world. We made this decision, we expected this to happen, that happened, or it didn't happen the way we expected to. So then you sort of look backwards and ask, okay, what did we miss? If I'm paraphrasing your question point. So if there's some key feature you missed, then you go back in and you say, well, if we put that in the model now, it seems to explain the response that we saw. And I think that's a process, correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, we do that every year in our assessment model. You know, we made a projection last year, we saw that, look at the last 10 years, we had a model that sort of forecasted things, that recruitment was looking pretty good and the stock should be recovering, and next year it didn't happen, and the year after that it didn't happen, and then finally we figured out, well, the problem was we made this assumption in the model, it was incorrect. That was just the fixed selectivity curve. Once we understood that migration is really contaminating the assumption of coast-wide selectivity being constant, we made that adjustment, and then it went back and explained the data better. It still doesn't mean that that was the right answer. It just seems to explain the data. What we're trying to do with this process is let's put that in the future, and let's simulate some crazy things happening, and then ask, is our current process robust to fish disappearing in 3A when we lowered the harvest rates and we expected the stock to increase, but the stock actually went down? So you can simulate those things in the computer, but generate the data at a coast-wide level like Ian does, and then ask whether or not our apportionment methods capture this process. So we're trying to, like I said in meeting 1, be a structural engineer and design and test something in a computer, just like a structural engineer might build a model building subject to wind stresses and everything else before it falls down. What you're describing is, let's build a building, it fell down in the wind, let's go back and assess what happened to the building.
Maybe. What I guess I see, though, is, you know, what a model does, and you know much better than I do, but what I think a model does is you provide some inputs, and you provide a structure within the model defining how much impact each input has, and then you get some outputs. And just like that forecast of the path of the hurricane, and there's the red part, and then the pink part, and then the blue part, you know, you make an assessment about what kind of danger you think you're in. What I hear this process, and so what I'm saying is, yeah, you can look a week past, once the hurricane's passed, and you know exactly where it went. And in this case, we don't really, a year or two past, we don't really know how much halibut was there. We just think we know better. The problem, and so I see those three circles up there all kind of interacting, and then I'm thinking about that path of the hurricane. Now you got not just one path, but three paths. And so that red area gets a little wider, or maybe a lot wider, and the pink area gets wide enough to take up the whole United States. And then, you know, you don't have, I mean, that's my struggle, is that you don't have much left to really make a decision with. And the hindcasting, that's sort of where we come from. But the other piece of this is, and I think this is part of where this MSAB process came from, we went from area specific to coast-wide, and I get the change, but there was a huge pushback at that point. And I mean, there's just a whole bunch of things that were, I mean, what's happening in 2B, and why were we able to harvest as much as we were able to harvest and there were still some fish there, or 2C, and now we've gone to another way of defining things coast-wide, and the numbers are much different. Anyway, it's all kind of confusing.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, I can really sense the difficulty there, and one of the, maybe the analogy for this one is that if you take it back to the hurricane one you were talking about, John, and there's this real spread of thinking there, and think of it in an MSE context, is we're trying to develop some sort of control rules and stuff in terms of the hurricane prediction that's robust to our misunderstanding in there. So when we use the MSE process, we can build a different weather system and say, okay, we're going to perturb this in some way. How well does our prediction algorithm work, or our management control thing work when it's really different like that? So it's at the heart of some of the MSE thing on this.
Bruce?
Yeah, it's Bruce Gabris. Steve, maybe you could help me out a little bit with, you know, in this process we're taking ensemble, and you're saying currently you're using 3 different models to help predict, or at least give you a better sense of what the population looks like. Can you help me with this, go back briefly, and kind of how are those selected? And my understanding, like for example in a hurricane model, you've got different groups that have different assumptions about the hurricane, and different, it's a different modeling in some cases says the factors are different. I mean, these aren't saying, well, we're going to use an ensemble, so let's just create 3 scenarios out of nothing. I'm assuming that they're all based on learned individuals that have studied this process, says this could be the right approach, that could be the right approach, or this could be the right approach. We're just not sure how close each one of these models represent reality. Maybe in some time after a while may have. Can you maybe enlighten me a little bit on how you come up with those 3 models, how those 3 models came about?
I'll give you the short answer. Ian can give you the long answer. In short, you're correct. It's sort of personal experience and essentially the modeling platforms as well as the available data kind of dictate what we can use for those modeling platforms. So Ian essentially took the model that he inherited when he started working here at the IPHC, along with some other software that he's very familiar with, and then put together those 3 models. They were each given equal weight, as I understand it, and essentially what the process, just like the hurricane forecast is doing, what we're trying to do is integrate over all of those models. Now, we assigned each of those models equal weight. So if Model A said to have an FCEY of 100, Model B said to have one of 110, and Model C had to say one of 120, then the FCEY would have been set at least the 50th percentile would have been set at the average of those 3 models. And now there's other ways where you can weight those models, but I'll let Ian fill in anything I missed.
Ian, can I maybe simplify the question to help me? So we've got 3 models that we're currently using. What is the most significant difference in those 3 models? I mean, what got me thinking in that, you said, look, these models we're using, they have embedded the migration. Migration is embedded in them. So that if that's all the same, what are the major differences in those three models? Why are they different? Or are they just the same thing in a different form? I guess maybe that's my question.
So there are a number of different assumptions built into those models. There are different assumptions about the rate of natural mortality. It's estimated in the long time series model, and it's fixed at the value we've been using for years in the shorter two models. One of the models uses all 100 years of data that we have available to us. The other two models use only the most recent data, which is complete across all areas, but it doesn't represent the full range of collective information we have. They make different assumptions about how growth and selectivity and spatial issues have been interacting over time. I mean, Steve is accurate to say that they do make many similar assumptions, but they are actually fundamentally quite different in terms of how they're built. Are there more models that we could add to the ensemble? Absolutely. In fact, I've been working on them right now. I'll be showing them to the SRB this week. There are lots more models we could include in the ensemble. The point is that as of last year's process, what we had were 3 different ways to go about modeling the halibut stock that did diverge pretty substantially. Where they didn't diverge, and the example Steve was using, was with regard to migration. All 3 were fundamentally coast-wide models. And so this year we're working on some models that actually have the data separated by area, so we can begin to understand how the different data, the data from the different areas looks, and what ways one might need to model that before getting to a model that has fully specified migration rates. What that might tell us. I think what everybody's trying to get to here is sort of what's the difference between an ensemble, an assessment ensemble with some different assumptions, and an MSE operating model which can have some different assumptions. And the stock assessment has a specific purpose. It's to estimate how big the stock is right now and what the trend has been. And to do that, as Steve pointed out, what I have available to me is the data that we have. And we may not even agree on what the data are, because maybe it's just the recent data, maybe it's the long data. But whatever we've got in front of us, I can use that in various ways to estimate where we are right now and what the trend is. The big difference between that, and that's really all I can do with the stock assessment. I can't tell you where we're going to be in 20 years. Doing a stock assessment is like driving a car looking at the rearview mirror. I can tell you exactly where we just were, and I can't tell you much of anything about where we're headed. And that's why when I make projections, I only make them for 1 or 3 years, because those are fish that are actually already out there in the water. We've seen them. The major contributors to the fishery over the next 1 to 3 years are going to be cohorts that we've already encountered in some form or another. The big difference between that and the MSE is that Steve doesn't need to be able to have data to tell him this is the way the migration rates work, or this is specifically how selectivity may be different in one area than it is in another area. What he can say is, well, selectivity might be different in these different areas, and it might be different by 20 or 30%. We don't know. We don't have any data to tell us specifically which direction or how different, but then he can run an MSE model and say, okay, here's a harvest policy that still succeeds no matter what's going on with selectivity. If it's different here and different over there, well, this harvest policy still works. And that's I think, the fundamental difference between the MSE approach and the stock assessment approach. So he can answer much bigger questions than I can, in a nutshell.
Thanks for clearing my muddled words. With respect to having an operating model that sort of represents the world as I portray it, the key thing here is you really want to limit it to a manageable number. We could come up with an infinite number of hypotheses about selectivity, or an infinite number of hypotheses about natural mortality, whether it's age dependent or size dependent, discard mortality rates, etc. The point is you don't want to integrate over the infinite number of models. What you want to do is integrate over the largest source of variability, such that when you are testing procedures, they're robust to the biggest sources of uncertainty. So the last bullet point here is focus on the components, the uncertain components, that represent the greatest impact on harvest policy. So last year, I stole these figures out of our blue book, Ian did some sensitivity analysis with our stock assessment models, and I believe this is the long time series model, so it's just one of the 3 models. And what he did is he changed basically the sex ratio in the commercial catch by plus or minus 10%, so either made it 10% more males or 10% less males in the commercial catch, and then reran the assessments under those 2 alternative assumptions. And what he found is that the terminal estimates of abundance have about a 50 million pound difference in the spawning stock biomass estimates. So this is basically an assumption in the model. We don't measure the sex ratio of the commercial catch, but we assume the sex ratio in the commercial catch is representative to the sex ratios we have in our set line surveys. And it turns out this is a fairly substantial assumption that has a significant impact on our estimates of spawning stock biomass. He did another sensitivity analysis, and this is your pop quiz. In this case, what he did is he doubled the wastage. So I can't remember what the exact number was. It was 3 million pounds of wastage. He then doubled the wastage to 6 million pounds over all the years. We have years estimates of wastage. And then reran the assessment model, and he got the exact same estimates of spawning stock biomass. So my question to you is, obviously the assessment model is insensitive to the assumption about wastage. Should we be concerned about the apparent insensitivity of spawning biomass estimates to the doubling of wastage? So it's 2 answers. One is yes, the other one's no. How many say no? We shouldn't be concerned. The model's not sensitive to wastage, so let's not be concerned about it. Throw your hands in the air. Thank you. Let's go back and redefine the question. Wastage. You know what the definition of wastage is. So you're a commercial longliner with a halibut, IFQ. You catch a bunch of fish, all those fish below 32 inches. You throw overboard, 16% of those fish die. We call that wastage in our fishery. So when we double the estimates of wastage, so every year we come up with an estimate of wastage, and how we do that is we take the O32, U32 ratio in our set line survey. So I think, Ian, correct me if I'm wrong, our coastwide, the average ratio of U32 to O32 fish is about 40%, plus or minus a few.
Sorry, I think that's bycatch you're thinking of. Wastage is much smaller than that.
Oh, yeah. So
that calculation is done on an area-by-area basis.
Yeah. So there's basically a ratio of fish we catch that we assume die. We don't actually measure. Question.
Is there, would you just double that 16%? We know we've been applying 16%. Wouldn't you just say, okay, if we're going to double it, we're going to apply 32%? Or
did you double the value or double the DMR? You doubled the value.
I doubled the value, and I think actually for 2013 it was about 1.5 million pounds up to about 3 million pounds.
Yeah.
So, and that's part of the answer is that it's a very small estimate relative to all the other removals.
So it's about 1 million. He added another 1.5 million pounds of wastage to this, and you get no difference in the results. So the question is our harvest policy, or should we be concerned from a harvest policy perspective about this wastage? Bob?
Have you pushed the model to see at what level there is a change? So that to see if it does at some point become sensitive?
Yeah, it absolutely does become sensitive at some point. And the other sensitivity, I don't know if it's Steve's next slide, was to bycatch. And that one I doubled in half the bycatch, and there you can start to see more sensitivity.
Yeah. So this one's just sensitivity. These are, the answer is yes, you should be concerned about it. It explains the data well, but again, that's the car driving backwards, looking in the rear, or sorry, driving forward, looking in the rearview mirror. But what it doesn't tell you is how it impacts the harvest policy. So we made a bunch of assumptions, like the discard mortality rate is 16%. When you change the wastage, in this case I did an example, and you're going to use this tool to play with this, where I changed the wastage from 4.5 million pounds to 9 million pounds, and I asked how would it impact our harvest policy. So under the current harvest policy, the optimal harvest rate is about 20%. If the wastage was doubled, we would have to lower the optimal harvest rate to 16%. Moreover, the TCEY, so this is the total coast-wide constant exploitation yield, is that right? That's applied to all fisheries only increases by about 1 million pounds, no, not even half a million pounds, but the fisheries FCEY, the directed fishery, it would cost you about 4.2 million pounds because of the doubling of wastage. Jim.
So could you, I forget how you phrased it, but when you doubled the wastage, you got exactly the same model result. You may not have said that, but what did you get that was the same? Was it the same size distribution, same age distributions in your resulting model, or what was the comparison that was?
This is, sorry, I'm showing two distributions of spawning stock biomass on this plot. You can't see them because they're exactly the same. So there's actually two different model runs there, one with 1.5 million pounds of wastage and another one with 3 million pounds of wastage. And my point is that the spawning biomass estimates and the trends in abundance won't change, but what does change that you don't see is estimates of stock productivity. So you'd get a different, for example, you might get a different estimate of natural mortality rates when you increase the wastage. So you still get the same amount of spawning biomass, but our interpretation of the data then is that this is a bigger, less productive stock. And we're taking off more wastage, so the stock is not as productive, therefore we can't fish it as hard. So what appears to be insensitive in terms of a time series thing and has no effects on the rear view mirror view of the world has huge implications in moving forward. And that's the point I'm trying to get home here, and you're going to get a lot of practice this afternoon with these examples. Questions? Bruce?
Maybe I'm a little bit slow here today, but maybe every day. But you're saying you increase the wastage basically is essentially taking more fish out of the water, whether they die or if they were by harvest or whatever. So then with the optimum harvest rate, when you showed the modeling, did you leave the optimum harvest rate at 20.20, you know, the 20%, or 16%? Because if you ran it by saying we have to go to 16%, you've accommodated for the wastage by lowering the harvest rate. So when you ran the two lines that are symmetric or similar to each other, were they using the harvest rate in both cases as 20, or the one at 0.16?
No, in this figure here, the harvest rate isn't used in generating these data at all. The actual catch that was observed or assumed to be observed, i.e. in wastage, was stuck right in the model and subtracted off that way.
So it would be reasonable to assume that the model wasn't sensitive enough to measure a impact of about 1.5 million fish.
No, my point is that the relative abundance data, the survey data, don't change with respect to our assumptions about wastage. So when we do a set line survey, those data, they may change as a result of wastage in the future, but the data we've collected to date don't change when we change our assumptions about wastage. So when we fit the model, what's going on here is it'll still fit the same trend data, but because there's more catch being taken off, it says that the stock was bigger but less productive. And if it's less productive, we can't fish it as hard. Therefore, the optimal harvest rate goes from 0.2 to 0.16. There's another question, and then Jim, Peggy.
Thank you. So going back to what John said earlier, how do you know which model is the one that works for us, the robot or the real human? One of the other points I was getting besides the one that you just said was what Bob said. We have to push this model, or we have to push our assumptions, maybe is a better way to put it, and understand all the moving parts, which are not quite clear in my head yet. So people who make a living at managing fish stocks understand this stuff a lot better than the people who don't. So I know there are many of them sitting around the room, and I'd really like to hear from more of them, just in different words, saying how these things affect the end decision, which is basically how much fish we can take.
Yeah. Two short points, and then I'll open the mic to the room to address your points. The first is the amount of the change in the assumption Ian made here is very, very minor, so you don't see much of an effect. So you would have to increase the wastage significantly to start to see these things deviate. The take-home point, second point, is that when you make different assumptions about things like wastage or selectivity in different fisheries, it doesn't change the survey data you've collected in the past. When Ian runs a stock assessment model, what he's trying to do is estimate a bunch of parameters that define essentially how productive this stock has been, and is that productivity consistent with our historical data. So when you start adding more catch, typically what happens in these assessment models is they scale up, so the overall stock historically was bigger, but the trends in the data are the same, therefore it's less productive. And same thing if you took wastage the other way and say we've been overestimating it, and you lower it, it'll say the stock was actually smaller, but it's more productive and more resilient to fishing. So those are the 2 points. Bruce?
I just make a point on this. I think this is getting a little bit confused, and Ian was trying to point this out, the difference between an assessment model and the MSC kind of process where you're trying to evaluate different procedures and different assumptions about it. In the assessment model, Steve just pointed this out, I think clearly, is that you're not changing the underlying data. When you make a difference, when Ian makes an assumption about how much wastage is involved there, he's not changing the underlying data that you're using, that you're fitting to. And that's why sometimes you don't see much sensitivity in terms of small removals. Now, if we were doing this the opposite way, which is the MSE process, we generate with the operating model a different set of data that then would be fit with something else. And that's the big difference in these two kinds of approaches to it. As Ian said, the assessment model is just to give you a status of what the stock is. The MSE process is trying to figure out, okay, if the world isn't behaving the way we think it is, how do we go about it now?
Jim was next, and then John.
Well, thanks. I was going to get on Bruce's point a little bit, so that I think that was a good description. But if you're looking at the assessment side, and so it's the survey shows what's there, and so it doesn't matter what you thought about how much went to wastage in years past. And so why did you say if it was relatively insensitive and if it was really big wastage, it would change? It shouldn't change no matter how much you assume wastage was in the past from the assessment point of view at the picture of the present circumstance. So it shouldn't matter if it was 100 times as much as it was if you look at the current status. So you say part of the answer is because 1.5 million is low. Well, if it's actually in the, unless I'm seeing it wrong, it would seem to me if it was 15 million it wouldn't matter because you assess it and that's the population.
Ian.
So you're both sort of right in that we get relative trend information out of the survey. Yeah, sure, I'll give you that. We get relative trend information out of the survey, and we don't know the scale of that information. And so if all we had was a survey index, then yes, we could scale the catches up by 100, and we would just scale our estimate. We might even not scale the estimate. But in fact, in this case, the changes aren't huge. They are between 1.5 million and a few million pounds over the end of the time series. The assessment model actually does estimate a different time series. The differences in the terminal spawning biomass estimates are between 0.5 million and 1.5 million pounds. And so it's a compromise between those two things. It changes a little bit because some of the information we have is in an absolute sense. It includes information about the relative strength of cohorts. So one of the ways that the model compensates for increased removals is it says, well, okay, those recruitments that we had 5 to 10 years ago, they must have just been slightly bigger, and then we caught them as wastage, and then they disappeared before we really ever saw them. But not all of it can be accounted in that way. So the assessment model is trying to estimate something that's consistent with all the information that's in there. The trend information, which is scale independent from the survey, but also the age composition data. And in the end, what you're basically doing is taking the catches and saying if you remove this much catch, the index has to go down this much, and each cohort that you have seen has to go down by that much. And so there's some scale insensitivity and there's some sensitivity to the scale. And it's not quite accurate to say that this didn't change. It just didn't change at the point size, the font size that we're using here. And that was my point, because my point in doing this sensitivity wasn't to evaluate how a change in wastage would, say, affect our catch tables. That would be a different kind of a sensitivity. This sensitivity was to say, if we doubled the wastage, would we be concluding something very different about the recent trend in the stock? So those are really two different examples. And what Steve is looking at is a third thing entirely, which is if we had a different perception of the wastage, how should we be responding with regard to our harvest policy? So those are really three quite different questions.
John, you're good. Okay. If we're fine, we'll move on to this. You're going to come back to it anyways, but we'll move on from this. Okay. Just by brief introduction, the two figures you're looking at here is essentially one way of assessing how you can go about these approaches. So the teal colored line and the orange colored line, if you're not colorblind, essentially represent the equilibrium yields you would get from the Pacific halibut fishery. So these are Pacific halibut data going into this equilibrium model. And if your objective was to maximize the yield in the the directed fishery, I don't know if my mouse shows up on here, then where this curve, where the black arrow is pointing, I don't know if you can see this on the webinar or not, but at the peak of the curve is where you would obtain the maximum yield for the directed fishery coast-wide. And then if you take the arrow and you drop it straight down to the x-axis, this would be the optimal harvest rate that we would use to calculate the blue line in the decision tables. So this is a big deal. Where in the orange scenario here, with the wastage at 4.5 million pounds, the optimal harvest rate is 20%. And if we were to double the wastage estimate, then the optimal harvest rate drops from 20% to 16%. So this is almost equivalent to changing the discard mortality rate from 16% to about 35%. It's a rate applied to different size classes. So that's essentially the point. The lower figure is essentially the equilibrium wastage in the directed fishery with respect to harvest rate. So if you want to maximize the wastage to feed the crabs in the ocean, you would fish at a higher harvest rate if that's your objective. Okay. All right. So I hope in the last example, we sort of highlighted some of the counterintuitive challenges between the sensitivity and model estimates and how, for things like in spawning biomass, versus how the sensitivity would be with respect to the policy parameters. So again, small changes in discard mortality rates may not have any impacts whatsoever on your stock assessment, but they actually have quite a bit of an impact on how you would move forward in the future. And that's essentially the point we were trying to make over the last few minutes. One of the key challenges that we face in building management strategy evaluations and operating models is choosing appropriate scenarios that identify the contrasts both in the fit to the contrasts in how well they fit the data, so that you might have two models that fit the data equally well, but diverge in policy prescription. So those are the scenarios we're interested in exploring. We don't want to find two models that fit the data different but give you the same policy consequences, because then the management procedures just do the same thing with either one of the models. But if you have two models that say you should do X and the other one says Y, those are the two models you should be exploring inside your operating model. I hope this makes sense. The tip here when you're thinking about this and discussing with your colleagues is don't focus on the spawning biomass and the trends in spawning biomass per se, but focus on how sensitive the parameters that define how productive the stock is. So things like natural mortality. So next time you see Ian do a sensitivity analysis, he's probably going to show you not how the trends in, well, he probably won't because he doesn't have time, but he'll probably show you how things like steepness in the stock recruitment relationship change with regards to sex ratios in the catch data and other aspects. So those are the points we're trying to take home here. It's 2 o'clock now. Do you want to take a break now before I jump into this? Or? Might be a good idea. Yeah. Okay. Let's take a short break. There's coffee and snacks back there, and we'll come back in 15 minutes.
Okay, can we get back going again, please?
Popcorn, that's killer. Oh yeah. Thanks everyone. I have good news and bad news. The good news is that we're through most of the presentation. The bad news is the hard part starts. That's good. Yeah. Again, back to the general management strategy evaluation framework, we have scenarios that represent things that we cannot control, and then we have procedures that represent things that we do control. So this is really, this half of the talk is really focusing on what it is we can control. So we focus specifically on the effort, the dynamics of fishing effort, and then sort of the management model and how the decisions process is being made to attain things. So one of the goals for the Management Strategy Advisory Board is to sort of establish a range of operating models to put on this list of things that you would like to test in terms of seeing how you can change the way business is currently being done, or should we just keep doing the way business is currently being done, and how well does it satisfy the objectives we set forth. So again, just to refocus you now, we're talking on the blue column here, focusing on the procedures, so things that we can change, such as size limits, how we allocate catch among different sectors, recreational, commercial, FSC, etc. With respect to alternative procedures, really there are an infinite number of combinations and permutations that you could put together. A colleague of ours, Rob Cronlund, I think invented a new word called combinatorics. At least the phrase he invented, the combinatorics will kill you, when they were going through the process for the BC sablefish fishery. And really what's key to making this process work is having a set of hierarchical objectives, and we have to define these things a priori, because you can use that as a screening tool. You may have, I've seen some of these MSC processes that have 600 or 700 alternative procedures they want to explore. And the first thing they go through is they find out is that 648 of them don't even satisfy the first objective, which is good news, because then you can drop them off the map and focus on the ones that do satisfy the primary objectives. Then you go through and filter again and find out how many satisfy the second objective. And before you know it, you've winnowed it down to 3 or 4 variables that you really want to focus on and control. So we've gone through this process. It's an iterative process. You may find that all of the procedures you put forward don't satisfy the primary objective. Then you think, well, we're hooped. And this was the case for the BC sablefish fishery. None of the procedures they put forward satisfied their conservation objectives. So what they ended up doing was redefining what conservation was. They basically lowered the bar such that they could move forward. Otherwise, there was just no point in even moving forward. A lot of us in the room have our own intuition about how the stock dynamics work, how the fisheries work. I certainly have probably my own intuitions about how the stock dynamics work, but I have very little intuition about how the fisheries or the markets would respond to changes in size limits or any sort of aspect. And this intuition is a valuable thing, and we need to sort of be able to take those intuitions that we have and plug them into this process, but be able to conduct a thought experiment with a little more tools at hand. It's sort of like having a pocket calculator to do your income tax for you. It kind of helps you. It doesn't do your income tax for you perfectly, but at least it helps you figure out what your costs and your expenses and everything else are. So we're going to show you some of that. Some individuals have a better intuition about the process, as Peggy clearly pointed out in her previous statement. Like managers have a pretty good intuition about how the stock will respond to different things. And some people have simply different objectives. There's many people in the room here who really don't care about size limits or anything else, but they care about what are the market conditions and can I sell this product. And so there's just simply different objectives. And we really need to confront these objectives and these trade-offs. The real meat here is that let's focus on what can be managed when we're talking about procedures and how we move forward. So what I'm going to show you, and this is all available online, so you can play along with your own personal computers in front. In fact, I encourage you to do that. Is a neat tool that we've developed here at the Commission. Thanks again to Ian and Bruce for a lot of the feedback on putting this interface together. It's really stolen from a sort of retirement planning tool where you would sit down and think, okay, how much money do I have to put aside today in order to have this kind of income 15 years from now when I retire? And the whole notion here is that you have to make guesses about what that income today, what the present value or what the future value of that income will be, and it depends on scenarios about the interest rates and return on investments and everything else that you have in it. We've done a similar sort of tool here where we have two scenarios you can explore, scenario A and scenario B, just to distinguish the two, in which you can adjust how your fishery gear operates. So you, as an individual, you can say, well, I'm going to change to bigger hooks and shift my selectivity to the right and only catch bigger fish and avoid catching smaller fish. Or you can shift your selectivity the other direction and start catching other fish. You can change the minimum, and you can even put a maximum size limit in here. So there's little sliders, and we'll walk you through this. You can test assumptions about discard mortality rates and how those would impact the stocks, and that was the previous example we just showed you. We have other tools here I'll go over in more detail. You can also change the bycatch selectivity and find out how much the selectivity on trawl caught bycatch, which primarily catches small halibut, how that impacts your yields in the directed fishery. And you can change the PSC caps is something that's used in the North Pacific Council, but the overall total bycatch mortality cap is an input into this interface. And then finally, for our processors in the group here, you get to set your own prices for the different categories, and then you get to negotiate with your fishing colleagues how much money you get to pay them each year. So this is kind of like a little computer game, and the idea will be to see how well each of you do in this computer game. So I'm just going to switch over, sorry before I do that. For those of you who want to follow along on your own computer, the little shiny application that we had before, this is a URL that I've been using. So at ipHD.shinyhaps.io/shiny. So I'll give you a few minutes to write that down or type it into your computers, and then I'm going to put it up on the screen, and we're just going to go through this slowly and explain it so that when Bob comes over and says, what would happen if we adjusted the bycatch in the trawl fishery, what would happen in the halibut fishery? He can actually sit down in front of his own computer, or he'll probably still get me to do it anyways, and answer those questions. All right? Okay. Questions? John.
Well, so I mean, I get how it might work, but the reality is the output's only as good as, you know, if you're making some assumption about size limits, or if you change the size limits, the output of the model then is based on all that input about size limits and what impact different size limits have. And my challenge is that just that piece, and every piece is going to be similar, it's going to have a fair amount of variation to it. So it's not like you can put this all into a model or make these adjustments and think, oh, this is what's going to happen. This is what the model says is going to happen.
Correct.
So, and I'm thinking aloud here, and this is always very dangerous, but what I like about that looking backward then is you can always, that's what I like, you can test yourself and see if you were right. And if you weren't, you got to figure out why not. The challenge, though, at least from my perspective again, is you've got so many moving pieces here that it gets really fuzzy. I mean, it's fuzzy to begin with, but you add more pieces, the fuzzier it gets, and then I think you have a hard time reading the answer.
Was there a question in there?
The question was, can I go?
You're welcome to go. Peggy.
So to kind of build on what John just said,
You want to go too?
The easiest thing to hang our hat on is what happened in the past, and to what's the phrase? To test things. How do we test things? How do we know what we're seeing is real? So looking in the rearview mirror is the easiest and most familiar. And so to apply that to this, which is a little non-contextual to do that, but when we get a better handle on all these moving parts, and when we use this tool, and when we really get familiar with it, how are we going to know, other than looking in the rearview mirror, which of these elements worked and which were robust to the uncertainty and which wasn't? Is there any other way to evaluate our success in the end other than looking in that rearview mirror?
That is an excellent question. To go back to our first meeting when Rob Cronlund brought this up, I think what you're describing is a process where we would like to test, say, a change in size limit and how that would go. So there's two ways you can do that test. One is to just go ahead and implement the change and let's see what happens. And I believe Rob Cronlund called that playing with live ammunition. Okay, and that's fine. That's certainly a valid way to proceed, is to just go ahead and implement the change and see what happens. The other way is to try and construct a model of the whole process, okay, and then test that in the model and see whether or not, and part of the reason you have this model is the model there actually produces the quantifiable outputs that you would eventually measure in the real test in the future. So if you're going to measure the changes in landed value or the changes in the stock size or any of those metrics, the model that you're building, which is the operating model, captures that process. So the idea is, let's test that in a computer and see whether or not it achieves the management objectives that we intended it to in comparison to doing nothing. So here's another way to phrase your question. If we change the size limits in the fishery and we let that go for 5 or 10 years, and whatever happens, what would have happened if we didn't change the size limit? Would we be in a better place today than we did? So I guess that's the point I'm trying to play. You can only test one hypothesis at a time when you're playing with live ammunition. All the variables are confounded. There's so many moving parts. It's the same way of saying the variables are confounded, that when you start to change one variable, something else changes and something else changes. So, for example, I'm not an economist and I don't know anything about, macroeconomics and how halibut abundance affects market prices, but pretty sure that when there's a lot of halibut out there, me as a fisherman, I'm going to get a lot of halibut to catch, but the price per pound is probably going to go down. Maybe not. Okay, and again, that's my intuition. Okay, other people who deal in the halibut markets and those things have those intuitions. I'm a person who sort of does numbers, and I'm trying to take your intuition and build it into a set of rules that help us to look at things like, okay, if we change the size limits, I'll do it in a computer, here's what the computer says, and here's what the computer says if we don't change the size limits. So that's my point.
Yes, but...
Rebuttal. Thank you.
We won't really know because there are so many moving parts. We won't really know whether or not that one element of this equation was the one that was wrong, because it could have been the unforeseen interaction between 18 other that we just don't, we're not aware of. So it's a little bit, it is a good tool, I think, but it's going to be tough to measure its success by that way. Better than looking through the rearview mirror and having a size limit for 5 years and living with it and getting screwed, for instance. But it's still, I don't have a ton of confidence that it's going to be rock solid.
Yeah.
Well, and if I could just add, the other problem is, or at least that I see, in that 5 years, you might switch into a time of really viable recruitment. And so all of a sudden what you think you got because you did size limits was not really their case, it was something else. I mean, that's where this thing is just fraught with difficulty that way.
I have Bruce and then Chris Spohr. Bruce?
Yeah, it's Bruce Gabris. Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking of this is more from the engineering design context. You know, first you have a really smart engineer that kind of knows material dynamics and weather dynamics. If he's building an airplane, wood or whatever, and that's kind of the group, you know, the technical experts you have here in the PhDs is that kind of sort of know how this works. And then you say, okay, they do it on paper. Then you say, let's build a little model of this thing. Let's put it in a wind tunnel, because we're not quite, or that our intuitions and our education may not take us far enough. So you take it to a wind tunnel, and then maybe it works, or maybe you find some flaws and you fix it. Then still, when you build the airplane, they still find there's issues. So that's kind of how I see this. We at least want to get closer to the right answer by going through this process, and we will only know if we have the right answer when you actually put it out of the wind tunnel and you build a real model. And that's to John's point. One of the other problems we have is there's so much variability. Like we're talking about, you know, PDO cycles, long-term weather patterns, ocean acidification. We can't control those things as we go through that. So that may be the driving factor, not what we're trying to test. But at least this gives us a reasonable way of approximating, as we know it, what's conceivably a better decision process by using some kind of a modeling, because that's something we could do. Like I said many times, you can test many scenarios, and even if we did the live ammunition test, as John pointed out, you may get the wrong answer anyway because of other circumstances changing that were dominant versus what you were trying to test. So that's kind of how that's how I'm trying to make sense of this thing. Is in the engineering design framework, we're just doing it on a fisheries model and using a computer.
Chris Spohr, please.
Chris Spohr. Bruce sort of touched on the point I was going to make, just that this is a modeling. It's the flight simulation example that was used at the beginning. The other point I'd mention, I think John raised a good point. Like, what if we base this on an assumption of, you know, it's a very favorable conditions for halibut? But I think wouldn't the model, the operating model, allow us as one scenario to say, what would this look like, sort of in a time of unfavorable conditions for halibut? Isn't that sort of one way to maybe test that type of thing? Say, well, what would this look like if things were very unfavorable? What would it look like under average conditions, or you know, very poor or very favorable? So I think there's a way to get around that. It's just making sure we take those into account when we think about running these different things.
Yeah, no, those are great points. Bruce Gebers.
Yeah, just one last shot. And ultimately, I think that's what we're all hinting around, that this is not a perfect solution. It is only a way of improving our odds of getting the answer right when we throw it into nature. And ultimately, it's going to be the wisdom and the judgment of the commissioners who are going to finally decide when these things get implemented what's, based upon that knowledge, what risk factors are you willing to accept, and then you're going to go for it. Then you're going to be shooting live ammunition, and hooks are going to go in the water, and we'll see what happens. So it's, I don't know of a better process, but I think we all need to acknowledge that it's far from perfect, and the results may be different than what we all thought.
I think that one of the things that I mean, you're right, Bruce. You're getting into the sort of the testing kind of phase for this thing, but we're trying to do two things here. We're trying to look at both the risk assessment, which is sort of looking at what scenarios are involved and what your parameters and how you actually structure the model stuff. And the other part's the risk management, and it's trying to come up with management procedures that are robust to misspecification in the risk assessment process.
That's a great analogy. If you extend that to the hurricane forecasting stuff, basically Ian's doing a bunch of assessments that are taking the blue zone, the red zone, and the pink zone, doing the risk assessment. So here's the assessment of the probabilities of the hurricane hitting this spot, this spot, this spot. What this part of the process is really trying to focus more on the rules of procedure we should have to do the risk management. So what we're trying to find is okay, we have 6 people, 6 commissioners from 2 different countries that ultimately, write down here's the TCEY, and in the decision table framework, the risk assessment that we currently produce as our stock assessment, they have to do the risk management, and they pick numbers off a table. I'm sure there's a much more complicated process behind it, but what we're trying to do is actually articulate those processes in addition to adding here's how the risk assessment, here's how the risk management framework changes if you change the size limit. So the steps in the decision-making process you would take may differ if you have no size limit, or if you have a PSC cap of this much or that much. So that's what we're trying to articulate here. The two processes are inherently coupled together. Because the risk management side of things deals with the outputs of the ensemble model, we have to make sure that when we do the risk management analysis, we have to make sure that we're at least consistent with the distribution of hurricanes that's going to hit the coast. Bruce Gebers.
Yeah, that's Bruce Gebers. One final comment. We keep using a hurricane analogy.
Yeah, we should just start studying weather.
And I think that's valid because it explains to me, the way I look at it, that explains the use of ensemble where you got different guys coming up at different ways, and they said we know where this is going to hit landfall, and I'm assuming there's an estimate of where it's going to hit, when it's going to hit, and how bad it's going to be. That's really their factors. I would submit to the staff here and to the commissioners that in the Halibut modeling, it's much more difficult because here within a matter of hours or days, you know where it's going to hit, and about a week later, you're going to know what the magnitude was. But when these guys, as the commissioners, have to make decisions, it could be years before we really know whether or not that really is what happened as a result. And furthermore, we're not adding into their model of other considerations like the social impact on sport fishermen. What does that do to a market if we go to a 26-inch halibut versus a 32? The hurricane guys don't go through and say, geez, how many houses are we losing? How much is the insurance going to cost if it hits in New York City versus if it hits in some other less populated area? So I only find the hurricane analogy useful in explaining the ensemble methods, but the task that these commissioners have, I think, is far more difficult, and the task that the staff has, it's not to belittle the hurricane forecasters, but I think their job is simple compared to yours.
Yeah. Any further discussion on this? These are great points, and I think that as the process evolves and matures, we'll all come to better appreciate these things. When you go to this tool that we've set up, you've seen this before. We had a shiny interface before where we were actually showing some of the results of the management strategy evaluation. When you first launch this, you'll come to this about page that basically just summarizes what this app is. It has an equilibrium interface, and there's a picture of it, and it describes basically what the controls are on the interface. I'm going to go through this step by step, agonizingly slow, so we all get it. And then there's a bottle of wine on my desk, and the person who can maximize the net value of the fishery gets to win the bottle of wine, and everyone gets to drink in their room tonight. What kind of wine? It's not Charles Schwab, I'll say that. Up at the top, you'll see there's an About tab, an Equilibrium tab, an MSE tab. So this one you've seen in previous meetings where you can select different scenarios and controls. And then there's a new Operating Model tab, and this is all under development. The tab we're going to focus on for this meeting is essentially the Equilibrium tab. Behind this, just for background information, there is a sex-structured, age-structured equilibrium model that has that's parameterized using the current halibut growth from the 2013 assessment. The fisheries selectivities are approximated based on the most recent assessment advice, as well as bycatch selectivity. So all of the biological parameters that go into this model are sort of fixed at this present time. And each year, as our assessment of those parameters like natural mortality rates and stuff change, they'll be updated, of course. So these are basically halibut data that go in here. I'm using the same scaling parameters that Ian's using in the assessment. So these are essentially under a completely different assumption about recruitment. These are essentially the MSY tables you would get. The interface, again, if you can see the arrow, each of these gray panels represents the controls you can change for scenario A versus scenario B. Right now, when you first launch it up, the values for both scenarios are exactly the same, so the distributions of values and the tables of numbers will be the exact same, and you can use these controls to do this. The first one deals with the fisheries, the directed fisheries selectivity, and it's essentially the size in inches at which 50% of the fish are vulnerable to the fishing gear, and this is normally a parameter we estimate in the model, but it's certainly something you're free to change by changing the size of hooks you fish on your long line or where you fish your fishing gear relative to where the stock's distributed. And the second little tab is where 95% of the fish are vulnerable to the fishing gear. So fish that are 40 inches, I'm assuming here, 95% of them, if you were to put a long line down in front of them, you would catch 95% of all 40-inch fish. Any questions on selectivity? It's a logistic curve.
Why do we just go up to 60 inches on that scale?
I'm pretty sure, I don't think you would ever go beyond 60 inches. That's a pretty big halibut.
Does selectivity vary by area?
Yes.
So but that's not built in here.
Well, our coastwide assessment assumes selectivity is the same for all areas but differs by year. So that's what's going on in here. Eventually this will be an area-specific equilibrium model, but baby steps. Okay. if you want to simulate your fishery catching smaller fish, all I'm going to do here is change the 50% selectivity from 34 inches to, say, 25 inches. And then you can immediately see the model actually runs in the background on a server, and you immediately see how that impacts the yield in the fishery. So allow me to explain the graphics here briefly. On the x-axis of each one of these panels is something we call fishing intensity. It's directly proportional to the harvest rate. So right now the halibut uses a harvest rate in some areas of 21.5%, in other areas 16.125%, and coast-wide it seems to average around 19 to 20%. So with scenario A, where you fish a certain size hook and catch fish at 34 inches, and scenario B, if you start to catch smaller fish at, say, 25 inches, on the y-axis in this top left-hand panel, I'm going to have to put the stickers on my hands here pretty soon, is the equilibrium yield you would get. So if there's no fishing, you're not going to catch anything, I hope. And then as soon as you put 1 day of fishing effort, you start to catch a little fish, and then 10 days of fishing effort and 20 days of fishing effort, or more and more fishing effort, you're going to catch more and more fish, and at some point, if you were to do this in the long term, you would start to see diminishing returns because you're now fishing so hard, the stock is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, so you'd be catching less and less. So this is the concept of maximum sustainable yield. What fishing effort level or what fishing mortality rate would you impose such that you would maximize the yield? And these are the simulations that Steve Hare did and Bill Clark did to come up with the optimum exploitation rates that are currently used in today's harvest policy. Scenario A is always red. Scenario B is always teal colored. Sorry about that. I'll try and make it a little bit bigger. Does that help? Peggy.
So why under scenario A, which is our oh, I see, the selectivity is the sort of the default. Let me rephrase that.
I think it's status quo in scenario A.
Sorry, I have a simpler, he had a simpler question. On the y-axis, are those days, 10, 20, 30?
Sorry, on the y-axis, the axis titles are actually in brackets here, is millions of pounds. So on average, you would achieve roughly 34 million pounds if you could fish at MSY under scenario B. There's actually tables for this, but I'll go through the graphs first and make sure everyone understands the graph. So the y-axis is in millions of pounds, with the exception of this one graph here that says operational efficiency, which I'll explain in a second. So the directed fishery yield under scenario A, you would fish harder, so more effort, you would catch more yield. That's the peak of this curve where my cursor is currently sitting. And in comparison to scenario B, so if you start using gear that has smaller hooks and catches smaller fish, or you fish in areas that catches smaller fish, the IPHC's harvest policy would eventually compensate by lowering the target harvest rate and lowering the overall yield in the directed fishery. I'm getting a lot of blank stares. Clear as mud or crystal clear? If you were to change from the existing policy, which is approximated by this red line, and started fishing black cod gear instead of halibut gear, then our harvest policy would eventually compensate by lowering the harvest rates when we do the blue line, and we would lower the overall yields in the halibut fishery. Nobody's asking me, why would you do that? Well, the reason you're doing that is you're starting to harvest fish before they've had a chance to become sexually mature, and also before they've hit the peak of their growth curve. So the maximum yield per recruit is a product of how fast you grow and how fast you die. So if you start harvesting them before they've hit that peak of that curve, also called growth overfishing, you're going to get less yield. And because you're harvesting them before they become sexually mature, we would have to lower the harvest rates to compensate. Okay, so this is essentially how the harvest policy is derived. Bob Alverson.
So without any change in the current size limit, you have boats using autoline and using their black cod gear because it's a pain to switch out the gears. So you have this going on with or without a change in the size limit. So what is the effect of that? Is it would that be downstream the commission compensates, the math compensates for a lower exploitation or a lower yield?
Yeah, the effect can come from two directions. One is we don't change our assumptions and we just assume that the set line survey, which is what we use to approximate selectivity in the commercial fishery, is still representative of the commercial fishery. Then the data we would collect in the next 10 to 20 years would be biased and we would underestimate the productivity of the stock, so eventually things would ratchet down. Okay, if we recognize that this is a critical problem and we now start collecting size composition data from the observer programs in those other fisheries you mentioned, we could then, in the assessment model, start to estimate rather than assume what the selectivity is for a fish, because right now all the Halibut Commission measures is fish that are landed. We don't measure fish at the rail, that are caught at the rail. We only measure fish that are landed at the dock, and the fish that come from the bycatch fisheries are from the observer program. So if we start collecting size composition data at sea in both the directed fishery and other fisheries, then we can start to internally estimate selectivity, and that's going to show up almost immediately in the assessment model, and we can compensate for those changes right then and there.
So follow-up, if you're assuming that your set line survey is indicative of the fleet, which it might be indicative of 60% of it, based on the logbook information we're getting, so are we underestimating annually right now what the mortality, total mortality is?
Well, we can't be sure, but the only place that we have direct data to compare at this point in time, since we don't have data from the observer program from last year on the directed halibut fleet in Alaska, the only place we have a direct comparison is the 2B fishery, where they log the piece counts of sublegal fish that they catch, and that's then validated through the video monitoring. And where we've done comparisons between the survey-based estimate and the piece counts that they're reporting in their logs, we actually got really close correspondence. We actually, in 2B, we use the logbook data, not the survey. We do it on an area-by-area basis, and we use the direct information from the 2B fishery. But that is the only place where we have a direct comparison. They don't collect size information on those fish. It's just a piece count in the logs. But we can compare the ratio in numbers of sublegals to legals that are reported in the logbooks to what we see in the survey, and it's honestly really close.
Go ahead.
So just a comment on that, Bob, is that part of the purpose of these sorts of questions is to help us figure out what to put into the simulation model so we can help you answer these questions. Now, in the case of this one here, you can examine part of this thing by looking what the fishery selectivity is. So if we're assuming that the selectivity is such and such, and the fleet decides they're going to go through a change in their gear and they're going to change their selectivity stuff, we can take a look at that and get some kind of estimate about what the impact might be. But these questions are really great for us to try to figure out what to build into this thing to be able to answer those questions.
Bruce Gabers.
Yeah, just as a historical perspective, I mean, what was the process when basically the fleet within a year or two switched over to circle hooks, and all the charts you see, when it was J hooks, and all of a sudden this catch per unit effort goes way up. How was that validated? I mean,
We actually did experiments. We went out and tested circle hooks versus J hooks.
Oh, okay. And okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So again, the y-axis is if you can hold our harvest rate at 20%, then you would read the y-axis off it in the long term over an infinite number of years, and assuming that the stock dynamics are relatively stationary, on average you would get roughly 32, 33 million pounds of yield under this new scenario. So that's the idea here is you can change one moving part, I like John's name, one moving part at a time and look at the impacts of this. So if I put this back to 34, Per's already got his own hypothesis, it's 30. But if you put it back to 34, the two things overlay each other, and then you can move on to the next moving part. Jim.
So you explained a little bit about the maximum yield per recruit, and of course the growth and that. But you suggested that it will also be due because of egg production, I think. And I'm trying to recall whether we really have any egg production, number of eggs that's got anything to do with our projections now, or whether you just said that because it's common sense. Because I think our theory has always been there's enough eggs, and we haven't worried about letting the big females go, for example.
That is a great question, and what's underlying here is that we do make, in this model as well as in the long time series model that Ian uses, and I think I am using the same parameters Ian is using in the long time series model, is that there is a density dependent juvenile survival rate from egg to age 0 or age 1, whatever Ian's using, that follows a Beveridge and Holt type recruitment model. You can also change it to a different type of recruitment model, but the key point is that the slope at the origin and the maximum juvenile survival rate, we assume a steepness value of 0.75 if you're familiar with the stock assessment language. And if you were to put the steepness value at 1, then you're essentially saying that recruitment is essentially independent of spawning stock size. So that's a sensitivity you would certainly explore in terms of the harvest policy. So great question. Per, you wanted it at 30? Yeah. I'm not going to change it at 30 right now, but we'll come back to it. We'll do 2 moving parts. The next one down here, again looking at the same yield plot, just so we're not always doing this, I'm going to change the maximum or the minimum size limit from 32 inches down to, say, 26 inches. So now scenario B in the teal color, we actually see that the optimal fishing mortality rate, so that's where you would drop this line, your cursor down to the x-axis where you hit the peak of the curve, shifts, so we would actually catch more fish with less effort, more tons of fish with less effort if you were to lower the size limit to 26 inches. Okay, so you get 3 or 4 million more pounds of halibut, and you reduce your fishing effort by 5 or 10% in so doing. The next figure over here is the directed fishery discards. Now this isn't the discard mortality. These are the total number of fish you handled that are below the legal size limit that you had to throw back overboard. So we know that the size structure in this population, we know the age structure in this population, so we can compute the total number of fish you handled. So the total number of fish the directed fishery catches is this teal line plus this teal line. So you're handling a lot less fish because you're keeping the small ones, in comparison to scenario A, where you were handling upwards of, say, at a harvest rate of 20%, you were handling upwards of 8 million pounds of fish and throwing it overboard. And then down here is the directed fishery wastage. This curved line, the red curved line here, and the blue curved line here represent the 16% discard mortality rate, which, by the way, is something you can also change. So that's on the interface right below the size limit, is you can now explore, all right, what if we had a higher discard mortality rate? How would that affect the yield? So I now went from 16% to 30%, and voila, you're still catching more fish with a higher discard mortality rate. Your optimal fishing mortality rate probably went down, but immeasurably at the levels we're using. The last panel I want to show you on the lower right-hand side is a term I coined for the Wakefield Symposium called the operational efficiency. And so what this is it's the fraction of halibut that are caught by the fishing fleet relative to the, it's the fraction of halibut that you catch and land relative to the total number of halibut you catch. So by lowering the size limit, you increase the efficiency of the operations by 5 or 10%. So you're throwing away less fish. You're actually increasing your costs, your efficiency costs by roughly 5 or 10%, whatever it costs you to set a line of, or set a skate of gear. Pardon me?
Decreasing the operating costs.
Decreasing the operating costs and increasing the overall efficiency of your system. So these are some metrics we put together. Questions? Bruce Gabbers.
Well, just actually, there's two parts to that. I mean, that looks great when we say just lower the size and look at all these good things that'll happen. And I guess the first question that comes to mind for me is, can guys like John sell a 26-inch fish, and how much of a price penalty are we going to pay if we land that 26-inch fish? And then the second one on that would be how big of a factor, and how do we factor in the fact that we're catching these fish before they're sexually mature, and we're giving up a yield of those fish? Where does that show up in the model? Because I don't know if it was done here at the North Pacific Council meeting. They said when they studied the shrinking of, the reducing of the size of the fish, that it was actually costing us like a pound or a pound and a half for every pound that we took out early. So how do we factor those in, or that's just not part of this model?
No, those are great questions. I'm going to deal with the first one regarding you lower the size limit to 26 inches. Well, fish below 32 inches are basically, fish at 32 inches are roughly 10 pounds. And right now the processors are only buying fish that are legal, which are 10 pounds and up. So down here at the bottom, this is where John Woodruff's area, where he gets to set the price per pound, or Brad, where he gets to dictate the price per pound. It's probably all of Hannah. And so if John says, I'm going to pay you $3 a pound for your 5 to 10s, well, that doesn't affect the biomass. What you want to look at is the equilibrium value. So there's a chart here where you can now look at the landed value of the catch, and I don't have the maximum economic yield. Generally, with each unit of fishing effort, the cost of fishing increases. It's usually a linear function. Fishing cost is usually a linear function of effort integrated over a whole fleet. So if you go fishing for 10 days as an individual, it probably costs you just as much as if you go fishing for 11 days. But if the whole fleet goes out and fishes 10,000 days, it's probably double the cost if they go out and fish 20,000 days. So on an individual basis, that's my limited understanding of fisheries economics. Don't ever make me go there again. but the point is that you would normally fish below the peak of the curve to maximize the economic value, and nobody ever does. The landed value shows up here. You can also look at the value of the fish you're throwing overboard. So if he's paying you $3 a pound, under status quo, if I put $3 a pound over here, you can see where my cursor is now, these curves really diverge because now you're throwing away fish that were worth nothing to fish that were worth $3 a pound in some other market. And so at a fishing mortality rate of 20%, you're essentially throwing $30 million overboard. Okay, but what dies is the value of the wastage down here. You're throwing $30 million overboard, but we only assume 60, well in this case, we only assume 16% of that is dying, so only $5 million actually was not recaptured in the fishery in the future.
Then how do we account for the second part, which we give up that growth curve by catching smaller fish? This may be an example. Maybe we're trying to problem solve here, but I think we've been here before on the size at age thing, because that seems to always, or not size at age, but the size to harvest always comes back to those factors. What does it do to the biology of us, and what does it do to the price?
Yeah. Just before I jump into that aspect of the question, you'll see these equilibrium yields, and then you'll see these value at MSY and performance metrics at MSY. So this plot here, what we're actually doing is taking the peaks of these curves and we're just plotting those side by side so you can actually look at bar charts. So there's very little increases in the landed value by changing to a lower size limit, although we have different discard mortality rates here. So if we change that back, there's very little increase in the landed value because you're catching small fish that aren't worth very much. If they were to give you $9 a pound for them, you'd make a lot more money because you're catching, basically the average size of your catch is much, much smaller. To get to your point about changes in growth, if the fish continue to get smaller and smaller, it's equivalent. We have a basically fixed growth here in this model, and we could make that change if you deem it necessary, but it's equivalent to shifting the selectivity towards smaller fish and having a higher discard mortality rate.
Yeah, it wasn't related to growth. It's catching them sooner so that for every fish every animal that's swimming in water, we're harvesting them at much lower poundage rate than if we waited a few years.
So if we put this back to $3 a pound and we shift our selectivity curve using Paris gear at 30 inches, now we're making less money. Okay, because we're catching smaller fish, you're going to get less yield per recruit. You're also catching smaller fish that are of lesser value. And it all, see, these are the guys you should be giving your bottles of wine to. If they give you $9 a pound for them, you get a lot more money. But they're not going to give you $9 a pound for it. So the graphics are kind of nice. There's also a set of tables that are directly related to the performance metrics that we've tried to establish that are related to our fishing objectives, or sorry, our MSE objectives. So now, the first table here looks at strictly the biological sustainability of the thing, and I report metrics on female spawning stock biomass, because this is our highest ranking objective, is that we want to make sure we conserve spawning stock biomass. SSB at MSY, so this would be the spawning stock biomass you have when you're fishing at maximum sustainable yield, is 117 million pounds, net pounds, and it corresponds to a depletion level of 25%. Okay, so we would reduce the stock down to 25% of its virgin biomass given the current mortality and selectivity and recruitment regime. The SSB threshold, remember this is one of the performance metrics we put in. We said we would like to keep the spawning stock biomass above, and that's this interface here, 30%, 70% of the time. So the SSB threshold would be 138 million pounds. And if you decided, well, I won't change that just yet, and then the SSB limit is the point where we don't want the spawning stock biomass to fall below, that would be 93 million pounds. So somewhere between 138 and 93, you'd start to ramp down your harvest rates, and as you approach 93, you'd get very, very little catch. Ian started to introduce, or will start to introduce this year, the concept of spawning potential ratio, which is a SPR, which is another indirect measure of overall total mortality in the spawning biomass population. The commissioners know about this. For those of you who haven't heard of SPR, you will soon. The spawning potential ratio would get depleted down to about 0.35, and it's just essentially a model output that corresponds to this level of mortality, including bycatch, wastage, and directed fisheries, would reduce the spawning potential ratio of the population to 35% of its unfished spawning potential. And then we give you three fishing mortality rate targets. FMSY, the fishing mortality rate you would achieve to hold the spawning stock biomass at its threshold. I call it target, it should be threshold. And then the fishing mortality rate you don't want to exceed, which would be the limit, F limit. First row is always scenario A, second row is always scenario B. So those are the sort of biological sustainability aspects. The next table again explains the fishery sustainability. This is the second major thing that this process is interested in. And the way I've labeled this table out is very similar to the way we do it in our current harvest policy. Essentially, the decision table we have in each row a TCEY, or total constant exploitation rate yield, or it's just a total catch for all fisheries combined for 26-inch fish. Is that correct, Ian? And so the TCEY here breaks down into over 26-inch bycatch, wastage, and then the FCEY. And I'll add to the FCEY also includes the recreational fisheries, the FSC fisheries, and the other personal use and other categories. So we haven't gone down and broke out those for the reasons that each area has its own specific rules for partitioning the FCEY. Questions? Bruce?
Just a technical question. Why is that distinguishing between the 026 bycatch and the under 26 bycatch? I mean, what's the significance of making that separate?
Ian, can you handle this one?
I think Steve's just trying to maintain some consistency with our current harvest policy, which does make that distinction. We include all the sources of 026 mortality in the TCEY and therefore in the exploitation rate. That's how our current harvest policy is defined. The U26 components of mortality in our current harvest policy are factored into the exploitation rate that we apply, but not the actual removals on a year-to-year basis. It's a topic of some considerable presentation at the June Council meeting and at our work meeting, and you'll hear more about it during this year's process. But it's essentially a gap in our current harvest policy with regard to the U26 fish being right there in the tables in each year's process.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah. The next thing I present is the percent of the total catch that is allocated, or the percent of the total catch that falls out in the FCEY after we've deducted off the wastage and bycatch. the O26 bycatch. So essentially, in scenario A, 78% of the total catch is allocated to the directed fishery. I shouldn't use the term allocated. It's apportioned. I don't know, whatever you want to use it. 78% of the total catch goes to the directed fishery. In scenario B, with a smaller size limit, 81% of the total catch would go to the directed fishery. And then you'll notice that the O26 bycatch in other bycatch fisheries decreases only slightly, and that's because their abundance is decreased because the fishery is now harvesting smaller fish. So the idea that the fishery catches and retains smaller fish, they're no longer available to be bycaught in bycatch fisheries. John.
Steve, so if I'm reading these tables, I mean, if the primary objective is to maintain some biomass level that biologically keeps us going forward, that is, that retains halibut as a species, obviously scenario A is a much better choice. It also, maybe it's not much better choice, but it also allows us to harvest at a much higher level, and this all assumes that all this stuff is correct and all the stuff you put in there is accurate completely, and the interactions between all those things are somehow working.
You're trusting me, right?
Yeah. But obviously, I mean, I just want to make sure I'm reading that right. It looks to me like obviously the scenario A, we get to harvest at FMSY 28%. That's a harvest rate, right? And the only downside of this thing is that we are harvesting much smaller fish. Not much smaller. We're harvesting smaller fish. Where'd you go here? But I think scenario A, we're harvesting, no, the scenario B, we're harvesting smaller fish.
Correct. You're retaining smaller fish in scenario B.
So I thought the graphs you were showing before, the green, the teal was higher, right? So that was B. No, the line graphs. Back to MS.
That's B, yeah.
That's MSY. Also, yeah. So you get to harvest. That's millions of pounds on the left.
Right. You get to harvest 40 million pounds.
And the reason your rate, let's see, directed fishery wastage, what was that? Well, go back to the graph.
Sorry, yep.
The horizontal line is directed fishery wastage. Is that what that says?
Yes.
The one up above though, that's your harvest rate on the left. That is the numbers 0.01, 0.2. That's your harvest rate. So
yes, on the x-axis.
Yeah. So
yep.
Harvesting smaller fish, your harvest rate is lower.
Correct.
But you're harvesting more fish.
Correct.
And the reason is because you're adding all this to the population of what you're catching.
Correct. This is the yield. This is the stuff they're going to bring back to the dock.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Yeah. And you're throwing away less fish when you have a lower size limit.
Well,
no, that has nothing to do with what you pay them.
Yeah.
You pay them zero. There's.
You know what, Steve? We'd never get away with that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Oh, you give them that cod.
I mean, I guess I just wanted to get to, you know, if your focus is to make sure the biology of the resource is taken care of, then and you don't, and price is not, that is, fish price is not the issue. It looks like the smaller you go, the better off you are.
Yeah. The point is that either one of these scenarios are feasible from the biology. They satisfy the biological objectives. The point is that if you remove the size limit, the first thing we would do would be to calculate the TCEY and the FCEY using lower harvest rates, because now you're retaining fish that would otherwise grow up and contribute to future generations.
But a couple questions. If you go down to 26, I think there's at some point the fish get small enough where they're not really selective to the gear, and I think that's about 26 inches. And so the other piece of that is, I believe, if you go down from 32 to 26, you start catching a lot of males that you're not catching now.
That's very true.
But the other part of this, John, that you can help examine here too by playing with the fishery selectivity is what happens if the fleet doesn't actually behave according to some change in size limits.
Well, that's the whole problem, though, is that all these variables that are built in here are so variable. Damn them. It just makes it difficult.
Beg my pardon. Mom, I'm in a meeting. I got to go. Bye. Yeah, that was my mom. Sorry about that, guys. Bob.
So you have sort of a three-dimensional movement here, and you have over a 15, 20-year period, this size of age is always moving. So would this suggest that size limits should also move with size of age? Or
that is entirely a question that is something you can manage. We certainly measure size at age through our set line survey, but there's two ways to approach this. Change the size at age and see what happens, right, Peggy? And then, or you can put this into a model and see, should we, the equilibrium model is kind of a hard place to do that because it makes very static assumptions about the population.